public utility, so let's make it a public utility. It cannot serve us Australians or Australian democracy if it's run by a guy for profit out of Silicon Valley in a place that's beyond the reach of our legislation. And so if we rethink it, reimagine it, then I think we can put it to our own use. We just need to start having those conversations, and we're not.
Can I just briefly throw in one other idea, which is that yes, definitely social media and certain forums can become quite toxic when they're poorly moderated, etc. I think a lot comes down to good moderation and facilitation. But part of our narrative of, we live in a more divided society and that's more adversarial and that's more confrontation. Part of that is a breakdown of respect and etc. But part of it is just that dissenting voices and marginalised voices have now been uplifted, so that previously there might have been a dominant discourse or a dominant narrative in society, and that was the only narrative. And now suddenly alternative voices are able to say, oh, actually that's racist, or oh no, you are oppressing me. And we call that division, and we say, oh, society's become more divided. Actually, it's finally the people who are being oppressed and were under the heel for so long finally have a little bit of a voice to articulate an alternative narrative. And that, maybe we call that division, but actually that's also a form of empowerment. So it's worth reflecting on that as well, I think.
One of the issues with social media, with the Recognise campaign that was put on us a few years ago, it was the Facebook, so Twitter, social media that we utilised to raise awareness of a vote no against the Recognise.
Karen, do you think social media companies have a responsibility to censor hate speech?
Well, they say they do, but I think that's selective as well.
I think there's an ethical responsibility that if you're creating a platform, you should be moderating it in some way. The question is who's making those decisions, and are these forums controlled democratically? Again, I keep coming back to Wikipedia, but they've developed a culture of moderation and facilitation where it's not perfect, but they do rein in hate speech and misinformation, and it's because the community around that open source platform has some level of control, whereas Facebook, I wouldn't trust a big corporation to decide what is and isn't hate speech because they've got their own motives.
LinkedIn is another one too, another social media space which operates with a great deal more sort of civility and respect. And it's partly because of the culture of the place, I think. I don't know, understand how the algorithms work, but there's an example of a way in which I think it can operate without the kind of vitriol which we often see.
Graham, what is horizontal censorship?
Right, so most of what we're talking tonight has been about traditional ideas of control of speech or sanctions against speech that come top down, so from law or government action, or even defamation, judge-made law that might chill journalists and so on. But increasingly, power in societies is wielded through corporations, universities, large organisations, who themselves sometimes censor, sometimes restrain, sometimes sanction speech. I don't want to talk about the unmentionable Mr. Folau. You know, that's a cause célèbre at the moment. Just one of a series of cases you could talk about in terms of, say, someone who's lost their job because of some series of inane tweets. Now, you might dislike what he says, or you might think gay discrimination law should apply to what he says, but to lose his job, and I've followed rugby league for years, good athletes can be nongs from the shoulders up. If you're tweeting in your spare time, it's not because you're private, it's because this is just his opinion, and it seems over the top that he could lose his job over this kind of thing. But we could talk about journalists like Scott McIntyre lost his job with SBS over tweeting some stuff against Anzac Day. It's not just in employment, though employment obviously is a big sanction if you lose your job and your livelihood. Here's another example. Just at the last election, I think one of the Fraser Anning mob went into an Officeworks store not far from here and tried to print off some electioneering material, and the Officeworks people said, no, we don't want to print this stuff. Now, fascists can go down the road and there's another place to print it. It's not like he's been denied access to a marketplace. But we're going to have a bigger discussion about whether we regulate and how we regulate some of these responses by people with private power organisations, employers and so on, to say, no, I'm not going to deal with you, I don't like your speech, all the way through to, you know, the powerhouse saying, we're not going to hold this event here because we don't like the topic.
Jono, what do you reckon? Does a corporation have a right to decide who does and doesn't get to keep their job based on their status updates in their private time?
I found, like, I didn't follow this whole Israel Folau saga very closely, but I think it's worth remembering, he's a public figure. We might call him a sportsman, but part of his contract and part of the role of these sports people is that they are essentially public figures, and there isn't a clear separation between your private life and your public life, and I think it's naive to pretend otherwise. I think also that we can lapse into the dangerous territory of thinking that all speech is equally valid, whereas there are forms of hate speech that do serious harm and damage. And if someone is saying something that is actively harming other people, and I suggest that maybe Folau's comments probably did that, then I think there is a case for limiting that speech in some way. I think there's an important distinction to be drawn between, say, someone with a big platform like him and some level of institutional privilege being disciplined by their employer, as opposed to a public servant or an employee who isn't necessarily part of a public role. They're two very different kinds of cases, and I think there's value in that distinction. But just in general, hate speech shouldn't be tolerated in the public realm, and I think the more important conversation is, okay, what counts as hate speech, rather than should we censor hate speech, or should we deny people a platform if they're engaging in hate speech?
There was another example where, just forgotten her handle at the moment, but an employee of the immigration department was...
LA Legal, I think she called herself, Ms. Banerjee.
Yeah.
She-
La Legal, LA Legal. Do you want to just explain, can you recall the dot points of what happened there in terms of what she was querying with regards to her department?
So Ms. Banerjee, behind her Twitter handle, was being scathing about the opposition and the government, about immigration issues. She was working in that department. It became quite clear to the department who she was. Some of the things she said were not revealing national security secrets and so on, but in the end she was dismissed, and she suffered, I think, some depression based upon that. She sued, both for unfair, unlawful dismissal, but also over her workers' compensation claim. Ultimately, she lost in the High Court. The High Court said that you couldn't just say because you used a seemingly anonymous Twitter handle that therefore as a public servant you weren't subject to the usual kind of rules that says that public servants have to appear to be relatively neutral. Now, those rules have been around for a long time. There's some good reasons for them. The reality is, if you're a public servant and you